In this video, we'll be covering how to import a file into Aquarius. So we'll basically be bringing in flat file formats, so for example a CSV file or a text file, and we'll be bringing in that file using the 4-step wizard. So the first thing I need to do is double click on Import from File, and then select those files that I want to import. So I'm going to click the dot button at the top there and select my example file, which is basically a SON file with a bunch of parameters in that file. So the next thing that we need to do is select Config Settings, and that will launch basically the Import from File wizard, so that 4-step wizard that we need to run through and define the structure of that file. And we need to define that structure because the default setting is text file. So we're saying that this is a CSV file and it's not a known structure to Aquarius, so we have to define that structure ourselves. If I hit the drop down menu, you can see that there's a bunch of kind of known structures in Aquarius. So we could select one of those, and if we had a YSISensor.dat file, it would kind of come in straight into Aquarius. We wouldn't have to define that. But in our case, it needs to be defined as it's not one of those known structures. So I'm going to leave it on that one. If we had rating points, so if we wanted to kind of overlay a rating point list on our rating curve, we could bring that in. So that's rating points, and also rating measurements as well. If we wanted to build a rating curve with all those field visits that we had, we could build a rating curve with that and bring that in. So that's the grey wire and the blue wire on the whiteboard, and also we can bring in file attachments as well. So any photos that you've taken out at a particular site, you can bring those in, for example, and attach them and push them down to the Aquarius database. So we've got our text file there, and I'm going to hit next. And the second step is to basically tell Aquarius at which row that data begins from. So we can quite clearly see that it starts on this row right here. It's exactly where the data begins from. And we want to kind of ignore the headers, if you like. So what we can do is hit the up arrow, and now Aquarius knows exactly where that data begins from. So the other kind of options we have in here is if we want to skip any kind of characters or tell Aquarius that these particular values that have been spat out by the data logger, for example -9999 values, to kind of remove them from the data set as well. So once we've taken care of all those funny characters, we can then move on to specifying the actual delimiter as well. In my case, it's the default, which is comma separated delimiter, but if you had, for example, a tab or space, you would specify that one as well. So moving on, step number 3. Step number 3 is purely to now tell Aquarius all the kind of settings and functionalities of each of those columns to kind of come into Aquarius at an optimal stage. So first column being our date column. So I'm going to leave it on that default, which is date and time, and select from that drop down, from that dot menu. Now you could search here and find that particular kind of format that you're looking for. Personally, I think if you can kind of view exactly what it looks like, you can type it straight in. So we know that it's 4 digits for the year, and we've got our months and days as well. Now you literally type in what you see. So if I had 2 digits for year, I would just type in 2 Ys. And also there's a drop down menu, so if you had kind of had that format before, if you had entered that format before, you could have just selected it from the drop down menu. The other thing to do is specify a time zone where this data set was collected. So you can hit the dot button and select from all the different time zones in the world that we have in the database. So in this case it's PST. And then we move on to the second column. And again, this is our time column. And again, we can just type in the hours and the minutes. No seconds, so we leave out the colon SS. And that's about it with our date and time format. Now those have been defined in Aquarius. The other remaining columns are purely our data, so we need to run through that and kind of specify column by column what's going on. Okay, so that third column is our data column of temperature. So what we need to do is set all these different parameters in here. The first one being that, okay, this is raw data coming in. So this is pure raw data coming into Aquarius in this column. And we're going to leave it on raw. But if we did have, for example, a column of data that you had kind of exported out of Aquarius with the raw, and you wanted to bring both of those in, you would then say that, you know, that column is our corrected column, and then you would map that column to the actual raw column. So they would be kind of mapped together. So once it's graphed in something like QuickView, for example, you could see that blue and green signal together. In this case, it's purely just raw data coming in from a sonde, so we'll leave it as it is. But what we need to do now is define the parameter. And what we can do is hit the ... button and search our database. Now notice that it's picked up that this is temp, so that temp has gone in here, it's searched, and all those TEMPs, all those words that contain TEMP have been listed. And we know this is water temperature, so we can select that, and here's OK. And now the associated units are populated, so now you can select the units that you're interested in for that data set. So we can see that that is 6 degrees Celsius. And the other thing that we need to define is the gap tolerance. So basically here we need to specify when we want the gap left as a gap and when we want the gap to be kind of filled in, if you like. So I'm going to leave it on the default of 60, and the subsequent video will kind of run through exactly what the gap tolerance is and how it kind of relates to, depending on the rating or the data collected, how that is affected. So there is a video called gap tolerance, and that's covered in that. The other thing we need to do is specify a particular label if we're interested in that, so we could give it a particular description, if you like. And also the interpolation type. Now, we know that interpolation type 1, instant values, but if you had the other kind of interpolation types that you're interested in, so for example a tipping bucket, for example, you could select instantaneous totals. But in this case, we're going to leave it on the default, which is number 1, and move on to the next parameter to set, which is grade. And you can, if you have that as a column of data, you can then select that and say this is a grade for this entire column of data, and you can say that this is, for example, excellent, good, and so on and so forth. So we're going to leave it undefined, and the same goes for approval as well. I'm going to leave that undefined as well. And then what I can do is run through all the other columns of data too. So in step 4, we have three options. The first one being how we want the gap processing kind of handled, whether we want a gap processing of 60 minutes, which was the default for all of those parameters that we set, whether we want it to auto-detect by looking at the sampling interval, or whether we don't want any gap processing at all. So we want a line between every tiny gap that's found within that data set. So I'm going to let it go with the default of that parameter that was set for each of those columns. And also, if we want to kind of pick up a bunch of files which have the same kind of structure and, for example, date and time format, what we can do is hit join the signals from multiple files, and what it will do in the background is join those, for example, 2 or 3 files, and then concatenate them into one output port. So that's one thing we could do if we had several files to bring in. And what I should have done, if that was the case, would be, once I'd clicked this button, would be to have selected all of those files that I'd wanted to bring in. In this case, I only have the one file, so I'll leave that unchecked. And the last thing is that I can save this as a configuration. So this entire kind of defined structure, I can save it for next time, so I don't have to run through that entire kind of song and dance every time. I can save it as a structure, and the next time I have that exact same file structure and date and time format, I can just, it will kind of turn into a one-click process, if you like. I can select the file, select the configuration, and it will come straight in. Now in this case, I don't want to save that either, and what I can do is hit the finish button, and then Aquarius will pass through that data and show all of those output ports from that file. Now, one thing to note is that if you had gone through that 4-step wizard and at the end of that 4 steps you'd got an error message saying that, for example, you'd put the date and time format in incorrectly, or there was some sort of error message and you wanted to go back through that 4-step wizard, it's available now, and what we can do is hit the config settings, and basically all those settings that you'd gone through those 4 steps are saved. So you can go back and say, okay, actually I shouldn't have put, for example, started import row 3. Everything's remembered, so you can always change them. So okay, we can change that to 2, for example, or we can say actually this wasn't the water temperature, this was actually air temperature, and so on and so forth. All of those settings are saved, so you can always go back to them and set them once you've brought them in. And you've got all of these ports now in this window, so you can right click and quick view that data. And also the other new feature is that you can highlight as many as you want, right click, and they will show, both of them show in the quick view as well. And once you hit the done button, all of those ports will be generated on the output port of the import from file toolbox. And that covers basically how to import a file using the new import from file toolbox.